Tonight, we're going to be doing a special two-part study on earthquakes. And again, this did come to play when various people have been asking me over the last several weeks, Kevin, what does the Bible say about earthquakes? It seems like there's an increasing number of earthquakes. We've recently had the earthquake in Haiti, and then in Chile, and then in California, the Baja, California. And in fact, for those that watched the video on YouTube for the Baja, California quake, I mean, people were astounded that earthquake was so severe, it destroyed the highway, and when you looked across the entire mountain range, the whole mountain range just turned into a fog of dirt because it just so shook that mountain range. It just took the soil and just shot it up into the air to where people were videoing it. They stopped on the road and they were showing these huge crevasses in the road that if your car would have gone into, you would have, crashed, and things that were happening down there in the Baja. And today I was reading, it was kind of interesting that Charles Darwin was on the Beagle when it was parked in the harbor outside of Chile, Concepcion, the same city that experienced earthquake, and it had an earthquake when he was there. And he was recording in the diary of the boat all the situations that were occurring, the massive tidal waves that went 30 feet up and wiped everything out. He wrote down the testimonies of how in that earthquake, much like what happened over there just a few weeks ago, how people could not stand up. It was impossible to stand up. The people, even the ones that got down, they either had to hold on to something that was also shaking, or they got down on the ground. And when they got down on the ground, they had to put their arms and legs out to keep from being flipped around on the road, or the soil, wherever they were sitting, lying down, to keep them from being thrown around. And that's about how powerful the earthquake was that was over there in Chile. And those are nothing compared to what the Bible says are coming to planet Earth. There's going to be global earthquakes like the world has never seen. And we're going to cover that tonight. And so, earthquakes, what does the Bible teach about them in our PowerPoint program? What causes them? And there's two different views of what causes earthquakes. There's the plate tectonic view that even some Christians hold. Institute for Creation Research, ICR, AIG, they believe in the evolutionary plate tectonic theory, only they believe it went really fast instead of over millions of years. They teach it. A man named John Baumgartner has a theory called catastrophic plate tectonics, and so he espouses the same as the evolutionary plate tectonic theory, but make it on steroids. It goes really fast. It's not unlike punctuated equilibrium in the biological evolution. People say, well, Darwin said over millions of years things changed from basic living creatures to more complex living creatures with chance mutations over time, and there would be many transitional life forms. And now that we know there are not any transitional life forms, people are saying, well, it happened really quick. There was punctuated change. All of a sudden, the bird became a lizard, or lizard became a bird. In fact, Gould, the man who popularized the statement, said the first chicken hatched out of a lizard egg. So it happened really quick. That's why there's no transitional life form. So some creationists, well-meaning, I guess, they do the same thing with plate tectonics. So we're going to look at what's the cause of earthquakes based on plate tectonics, and then we're also going to look at it next week from the Hydroplate Theory, Dr. Walt Brown's Hydroplate Theory, which is an all-encompassing theory of how the flood of Noah occurred and why there are these forces at play in the earth today causing earthquakes, and why his theory would explain why there's going to be global earthquakes. Plate tectonics would predict there would be no way to have a global earthquake. So we're going to be able to see which one is right from that, and then which theory fits the evidence and is consistent with biblical prophecy. So tonight we're going to start with what does the Bible have to say about earthquakes, and then we're going to look at what does plate tectonics teach about earthquakes. And obviously we're going to have to do a pretty quick presentation of what plate tectonics says because we don't have time to get super into it. And I'm trusting that most of you have been through school, you already have been taught, because that's all you get taught in school. It's plate tectonics, pretty much taught as fact. We'll see if the evidence supports what they teach. So what does the Bible teach about them? There's no record of earthquakes before the flood in the Bible. We can't say that means there were none, because the Bible doesn't record anything about earthquakes before. I don't believe there were any earthquakes before the flood. The sorts of earthquakes today are a result of the flood and wouldn't have been there before the flood if the hydroplate theory is correct. Earthquakes did occur after the flood. How do we know that? Well, Mount Sinai in Psalm 68:8, it says, "The earth shook, the heavens also dropped rain at the presence of God, and Sinai itself was moved." So Mount Sinai shook and was moved at the giving of the law. When God was giving the law to people at the presence of God, the God of Israel. And then in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11, when Elijah was running away from Jezebel and went to the same Mount Sinai and was hiding in the cleft of the rock, and he said, I'm the only one left. And God went through a sequence of events, but he says in verse 11, 1 Kings chapter 19, then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, and behold, the Lord passed by, and after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake." So there's a couple of places in Mount Sinai where the Bible says there was an earthquake in Mount Sinai. Earthquakes did occur after the flood. Another way that we know, Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5, actually is prophesying of an earthquake in Jerusalem in a day yet future to us, but it alludes to an earthquake that happened in the distant past during the days of Uzziah, when it says in Zechariah 14:5, speaking to a future Jewish people, even future to us, it says to them, "Then you shall flee through my mountain valley," which God is going to create when Jerusalem splits in two, splits and divides from north to south, moves to the north and south, right through the east gate of Jerusalem. "For the mountain valley shall reach to Azal. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah." So there was a severe earthquake during the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and that earthquake caused the Jews to have to get away from the city, get away from things that would fall down because of aftershocks, whatever that happened because of that severe earthquake. Amos chapter 1, verse 1 makes it clear it was a severe earthquake that everybody knew about, because it says, "The words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." Before the earthquake. It'd be like somebody writing history in Chile. This was 2 years before that big one hit. And so there was a big one in the day of Uzziah. So what does the Bible say generally about our future pertaining to earthquakes? And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 25 through 27, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is, don't refuse God. Don't refuse to listen to him. Why? Who speaks? "For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven." So when God's voice came down from Mount Sinai, it shook Sinai. And he shook the earth and showed his presence to the people of Israel. And it said, and the law continued to reign, and it brought death to those that disobeyed, is what the writer of Hebrews is saying. And so he's saying, don't forget to pay attention to what God says, because he says again, I'm going to shake just not the earth, but I'm going to shake heaven. And my view of how he's going to shake heaven is, what's he going to shake heaven? He's going to shake Satan and his troopers out of heaven. When we know that in the tribulation period, he shakes the earth and he shakes Satan right out of heaven, and he's gone. And so we ought to pay attention to the God who's going to bring both of those events out. And now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things which are being shaken as of things that are made. We're going to see in some ensuing verses about the coming future earthquakes, every city is destroyed. Every mountain is moved. The islands flee away. there is going to be a global earthquake, which everything man has made is going to be shaken, destroyed, no more. People will be living in caves because they won't be able to live in houses or anything else because it'll be too dangerous to go into. And many of these places that experience these severe earthquakes, they don't want to go back into their house. They know the next second there could be an aftershock, and whatever was made by man's hands is going to be falling down upon their heads. And so that's just another place. Also, there's a very specific prediction in the Bible about a future earthquake in the city of Jerusalem. The timing of this in Revelation chapter 11 is God has sent two witnesses to planet Earth, I think in the context of the chapter, to oversee the reconstruction of the Jewish third temple, the third temple of the Jews in Jerusalem. Anybody that tries to disrupt that building project is going to be judged by these two witnesses, will be able to call fire down from heaven. Well, ultimately, after 3.5 years, the Antichrist is able to kill these two guys. And they lay in the streets for 3.5 days in the street of Jerusalem, and the whole world is partying because these bad guys, as far as they're concerned, are dead. But then they're going to resurrect, and they're going to ascend into heaven. And in Revelation 11:13-14, in the same hour, when the two witnesses of God resurrect after being killed by the Antichrist, there was a great earthquake. And John is speaking was, past tense, because he was jettisoned. John the Apostle, who wrote the book of Revelation, was jettisoned into the future and was watching the events take place. And he saw the earthquake. And so there was an earthquake, a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city of Jerusalem fell. In the earthquake, 7,000 men were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Isn't that amazing? I mean, this is the most exacting prophecy of earthquake and death. There's the headline in a future newspaper: massive earthquake hits Jerusalem at the same time these two witnesses resurrect into heaven after the Antichrist killed them. 7,000 men are dead. Maybe it just means men, could mean mankind, but men, and then there's going to be women and children or whoever were affected. But it'll be an exacting prophecy fulfilled, that everybody will be able to give glory to God that is humble, because they're going to realize everything happened exactly like the Bible had predicted. Global earthquakes in our future in another prophecy of the Old Testament, Ezekiel chapter 38. Again, the timing of this is yet future. It's going to be a time where Gog, who is the leader of a consortium of nations that are coming to finish off Israel, to try and destroy Israel, and without getting into a detailed study, because we have no time, this leader is going to be from Russia. Russia will be joined with Libya, Turkey, Iran, and Sudan, Ethiopia, to come and destroy Israel in a day yet future to us. And I think after the coming war with the immediate neighbors of Israel. And then it says, when they do that, surely in that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. The mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. Now, there's a little bit of debate, because it says there'll be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, but then it talks about all men on the face of the earth. So it could be all men on the face of the earth in the land of Israel, or it could mean that there was a great earthquake there, but there was actually a massive earthquake in the rest of the world, that this is a global earthquake that is going to also affect the nation of Israel, and this earthquake will play into the destruction of the nations that are coming to destroy Israel. And God will be able to do that. In the days of Moses, when the gainsaying of Korah came against Aaron, and Korah was saying, we should be high priests too, like you. And God told Moses and Aaron, just tell those guys, Korah, to stand over there, and everybody that wants to agree with them, you just go to that side. And Moses and Aaron and everybody that agreed with God's selection of who was supposed to be priests stood on this side. And then I will show the people which one who I think should be high priest. And then the earth just opened up and took all the people of Korah and then slammed them shut. And in earthquakes, the ground opens and closes up. In fact, one of the accounts in Darwin's diary of the earthquake were testimonies of this one woman who saw the ground open up and take her child, and then she had to run, and then it came together, but not enough to crush her. They were able to go and rescue her. But it was just like all of a sudden the ground opened and she went down. And what we know is that when this army comes to invade Israel, the earthquake is going to be destroying much of that army. And it could just be, crevasses opening up as a result of the crust breaking apart and swallowing up the armies of Gog and Magog, along with fire and brimstone coming down upon them and the armies turning against each other. They're completely annihilated. So, earthquake is, if we were to be around, I believe that the church will be raptured by the time of that battle. But if not, won't it be exciting to see, to be able to know? We'll be able to tell all of our friends and neighbors, stand by for earthquake. And they're going to say, why? Because the Bible says one's coming right now. By the way, everybody should have a dog. If you're worried about earthquakes after this study, everybody should have a dog, because another thing that happened in Concepcion in the days of Darwin is all the dogs took off just before the earthquake. And in this recent one in Chile, they had video on YouTube of this dog sitting down in an office building, security cameras going on in the office building, and all of a sudden the dog just up and phew, and then a few seconds later the place went going. And so if your dog all of a sudden is acting like, I'm out of here, follow your dog. With or without a leash, take off. It seems God somehow tells the dogs before he tells us what's coming. But Revelation 6:12 through 17, another global earthquake. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and these are the seals on the scroll, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, and the fig tree, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind, then the sky receded as a scroll when it was rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Now there's something else going on here. It talks about things from the heavens falling down on earth, and we're going to see several passages in Revelation, even the Old Testament, talks about things falling to the earth. And the Bible says that the last day's judgment won't be by flooding, it'll be by fire. And we saw this little old volcano in Iceland shoot stuff up tens of thousands of feet into the air. We could have a massive volcano going off that would launch rock and debris from the crust above the pressure of the magma pools and stuff that would send stuff up into space. And then over a period of hours, come down and rain rock and debris all over the world. And it seems like that's what's going to be happening. There's going to be that kind of power. I mean, there will be the unleashing of pent-up energy underneath our crust in these magma pools that could cause volcanic activity that makes what we've seen so far seem like nothing. And we know that at the same time these kind of things are happening, this global earthquake that's happening is also causing the mountains and the islands to be moved out of their place. And then in Revelation 6:12 through 17 continued, and the kings of the earth and the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man. That means it doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter what kind of house you have, everybody hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Nobody's staying in their houses globally. Everybody is hiding because you need something strong like a cave to keep from being hit by the debris that's coming down upon the earth. Isaiah 24:19 through 23 gives the same kind of a description of a global earthquake, where it says, the earth is violently broken, the earth is split open, the earth is shaken exceedingly, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall totter like a hut. Its transgression shall be heavy upon it, and it will fall, and not rise again. And I think fall, the mountains are going to go down. We're going to see another verse that talks about that. The valleys will be raised up, and it's going to be done. When this global cataclysmic earthquake happens to cause stability to come to the Earth's crust, after many years of being unstable because of the flood, it'll be done. And actually, that's a good thing, because Jesus is coming back. The earth is going to be restored, and we're not going to have to worry about earthquakes during Jesus' reign here on earth. They're going to be gone. There's not going to be any heartaches or tears or anything else. No trouble with earthquakes, because it's going to be done. But just before he comes, the earth is going to be in a major readjustment, and the earth will roll. And we'll talk about that more next week, because we're going to get into the hydroplate theory of what's behind earthquakes, and you'll see why the earth will roll. And finally, continue with Isaiah 24:19 through 23, it shall come to pass in that day. So here's the timing of it. In that day, the Lord will punish on high the hosts of exalted ones. Who's the host of the exalted ones on high that he's going to punish? Satan. He's going to punish Satan, we know from Revelation. That's during the last days, and he's done. He's going to lock Satan up. And on the earth, he's going to punish the kings of the earth. Who are they? The Antichrist and his leaders of the 10 nations that were fighting in the battle of Armageddon against his Jewish people to annihilate them. They will be gathered together as prisoners and gathered into the pit. Revelation says they're thrown into the lake of fire, and will be shut up in the prison. After many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be disgraced, the sun ashamed, and the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before his elders gloriously. So what's the timing of this? The timing of the most massive global earthquake that the world has ever seen, as we're going to see in the next verse, is right when Jesus comes back. And leading up to that, there's going to be many earthquakes, because Jesus said there will be many earthquakes in various places, culminating in the mother of all earthquakes in global history. And then Revelation 16:17 through 21, and I think this is the final one. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and the loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. And so there it has, and that's synonymous with when Jesus comes back. And the great city, Jerusalem, was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. All the cities of the nations fall. And great Babylon, many believe it's going to be a restored Babylon over in Iraq, was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. Again, global earthquakes are going to cause global volcanoes. Again, the diary of Darwin said that every volcanic mountain lit off in the Chile earthquake in his day. See, earthquakes are the breaking up of the crust, allowing the magma underneath to be exposed, and the energy from that to be released to the earth. And then the final topography change, where it says in Isaiah 40, and this is in the Handel's Messiah, they sing about this verse, it says, "Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill brought low." There will be a topographical change of the earth. And the Dead Sea becomes a live sea, we know, when Jesus returns. And we know it's 1,200 feet below sea level right now, and there's no way to make it alive, because water flows into there, minerals flow into there, water evaporates out. There's no way to turn it into a live sea unless it lifts up 1,200 plus feet to start dumping into some other ocean so water can get in there to make it okay. There's going to be major crustal upheavals. So what does the Bible teach about earthquakes? They have been in our past since the flood of Noah. We haven't seen anything yet. Future earthquakes will be global and will destroy all cities, move mountains, remove islands, change the topography of the earth, and cause the earth to roll on its axis. Don't want to be here, really. And even if we are here when an earthquake hits Washington and we die, isn't it kind of nice to know We have reservations. That we get graduated into some place that cannot be shaken, because that's what Jesus said in Hebrews. He says he's going to shake the things that are man-made to prove what cannot be shaken. What cannot be shaken is our faith in Jesus Christ. What cannot be shaken are the things in heaven, the things that are built upon the rock. In fact, that's another thing Darwin said in this diary, is every single building that was built on anything but a few houses that were built on the rock stood. The rock, bedrock of the area, but everybody else, it was just building their houses in the available land. But there was a couple of rock outcroppings. Those houses built on the rock stood. Isn't that what Jesus said? Build your house upon the rock, and it will stand. If your life, your soul, is trusting in Jesus, the rock of our salvation, then nothing that shakes on this earth can steal that away from us. And that's something we have to be aware of, because we do happen to sit in an earthquake zone, and at any day we could have a severe earthquake, and it could affect every single one of us. But if we keep the perspective of our hope in Jesus, it can't affect that. These global earthquakes, by the way, I mean, people think about the magnitude, a magnitude 8 going to a magnitude 9. Imagine the Chile quake that's 10 times worse, because going from 8 to 9 would be 10 times worse. And it's hard for us to comprehend that if we were in a 9 or 10 earthquake, it wouldn't be a matter of just being able to spread your arms to keep from rolling around. You would likely die from the earth acting like a trampoline underneath you, because it would launch you up into the air. You would be literally flying up into the air and then coming down on a ground that could be coming up to slap you again. I mean, we have to understand when people talk 9s and 10s, you're talking about earthquakes that are incomprehensible. You could be out in the open, nothing to fall on your head, and you could die just from the violence of the earth throwing you around. I don't know why I wanted to encourage you with that. For a while it would be kind of fun. Can you imagine, just this is a trampoline? Oh, let's time this just right. Grab a tree on your way down. So what causes them? Well, we only have time tonight to look at what causes them from an evolutionary plate tectonic perspective. And I'm using evolutionary web pages to give you this information so that, people won't think that, we're using some crazy Christian person. This map of the 10 major plates and minor plates comes from Wikipedia, but the wording comes from science.org about earthquakes. And this is what science.org, an evolutionary webpage, says. Most major earthquakes are natural events. God would differ. The outermost shell of the earth, called the lithosphere, is divided into 10 major and many minor tectonic plates. Now, I know you can't see it very good up there, but each one of these plates has little arrows and about the relative motion between each other and how they're moving apart or moving towards each other. And these are important, especially if you still have to go through school and take a test on all this. And what's really important is that this is what the theory, and I'll expound on this more later because I show another picture of this later, but this is the way the theory would say everything is moving. And just pay attention right here, because this line right there coincides with the mid-Atlantic ridge. On the ocean floor is this mid-Atlantic ridge. And plate tectonic theory says that this ridge is where there's seafloor spreading. So the ridge is hot, mantle material is building up, and then after it gets built up at the ridge, then the gravity wants to cause the plate to move and push the whole North American plate to the west. And you'll notice that the North American plate is rather large. It includes the entire western side of the Atlantic Ocean, all of North America, all of Greenland, Iceland, Alaska, and even parts of Russia. And this is saying that it's moving away from the ridge. The South American plate's moving away from the ridge to the west. The African plate's moving away from the ridge to the east. Europe's moving away to the east. See that? Everybody see that? That's not the way actual movement is occurring. We're going to see in the actual GPS technology knows which way things are moving. But this is their dream. This would be, if their theory were right, this all makes sense. But it doesn't make sense, as we're going to see. Again, from science.org, that most major earthquakes occur on and adjacent to the boundaries between plates. So if all this movement is occurring, all these plates are moving, inch or so a year for millions and millions of years, causing all the continents to get to where they are, then everything's moving. Everything's building up stresses along all of those boundaries. So you look at all these boundaries that are all over the world, you would expect earthquakes along all those boundaries, right? You don't. And if this statement were true, we would expect earthquakes to be equally distributed along all the dark lines of their map, their Wikipedia map on plate tectonics. Does that look like, like it's an example of those dark places? This is actually taken from the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey map of earthquakes. You can check this on the website. You can go to earthquakes on USGS, and these squares are indicative of the size of the earthquake and how recently they occurred. So if you look, you can see the red squares are earthquakes that happened within the last hour when I snapshotted this off of the website here a few weeks ago. So red means it happened within the last hour, and you can see that when I took this off the website, that earthquake right there in the Baja, this was right when Baja was lighting off with those big earthquakes, that was still an hour old right there. And the blue, you can see a couple blues on there, those are within the last 24 hours. Yellow is within the last week, and then after they're a week old, as soon as they become 1 week old, they drop off the map on the website. And this number right here is the number of earthquakes over a certain magnitude on the entire Earth that's represented by this snapshot. So there's 1,354 earthquakes globally on this map that are over the threshold. They cut it off because they could go down to 1 on the global scale, and you'd have even more than that. So they cut it off at the global scale, I think, at 2.5, 3.5, at 3.5, and they cut off, except the America part, I think, is at 2.5. So it's their standard, though. And you can follow the frequency of earthquakes on a weekly basis by looking at this every day, and I've been doing it and databasing it for 5 years. So I take that number every day and put it into a database for the last 5 years. So you can see that most of the earthquakes are located, 80% of earthquakes happen in the Pacific Ring of Fire. And they don't have an explanation of why is it all there when there should be earthquakes kind of equally distributed all over the world. And they have several different reasons they try and come up with, but we'll see by their own words they're not sure about it. So again, this is wording from science.org, evolutionary. The plates move constantly, if slowly, against each other, creating stresses that build up over time. An earthquake occurs when these stresses are suddenly released. The resultant seismic waves radiate in all directions, including towards the Earth's surface. So all those little plates are moving and they build up their pressure over years and years and years, and when they finally snap, that causes the earthquake. We hear that every single time we have an earthquake. That's what the seismologists at the University of Washington, every time we have an earthquake here, yeah, you know, it's been grinding along, it finally let loose, and that's what happened. That's what the seismologists at the University of Washington, every time we have an earthquake here, yeah, you know, it's been grinding along, it finally let loose, and that's what happened. Along the subduction zone, or Wanda Fuca plate, and, you know, all this other stuff. But again, the evidence is really not supporting that, and we would see, as we go into the next video, that what they say in their nice little picture, see, this is a nice little picture of how this whole thing works. It all caused by movement. And by the way, because that movement is upon all those fracture points all over the world, those plates all over the world, they will say, and they say to this day, that an earthquake over in Chile has nothing to do with the earthquake that happened the day before in Japan, would have nothing to do with the earthquake that happens in Alaska or in the Baja or whatever else, because all these plates are just separated by so many thousands of miles and their stresses are all different. So evolutionary plate tectonics would predict there will never be a global earthquake. They would say that these Bible verses that talk about a global earthquake cannot be true. But the hydroplate theory that we'll cover next week on the source of earthquakes will predict, it predicts there will be global massive earthquakes by just understanding the reason why we have earthquakes today from a flood of Noah perspective. So again, this is Wikipedia explaining this picture. And it says tectonic plates are able to move because the Earth's lithosphere, which is, if you can't see it there, this is a lithosphere. This is a top lighter density, so it's floating. They think it floats on this lower part. Has higher strength and lower density than the underlying asthenosphere. Their movement is, now these are important words, thought to be, meaning they don't know. It's thought to be driven by the motion of hot material in the mantle. Later on, the same article in Wikipedia says that that's what scientists used to believe. They now know it's not possible. So you read the same Wikipedia article on plate tectonics, and they'll tell you right here, this is how this picture is explained. And then it goes on, people used to think this, but now there's no way it can happen. So instead of just cleaning up the whole article, they really are in a quandary. They know things do not happen the way they expect them to, but they keep the story going. Their movement is thought to be driven by the motion of hot material in the mantle. Lateral density variations in the mantle result in convection. So in layman's terms, hot mantle here wants to rise up, and then lateral density differences make it want to just kind of go like this, like a conveyor belt, and circulate the crust of the earth and dive it down into the earth, which is transferred to tectonic plate motion through some combination of drag, downward suction at the subduction zones, and variations in topography and density of the crust that result in differences in gravitational forces. The relative importance of each of these factors is unclear. These are their words. It's unclear because, you know what, these are all a bunch of fancy words that how many people, they know the physics don't support these statements. There isn't a place inside the earth that's sucking, not by plate tectonic theory, but there is a sucking, there is a reduction force on the hydroplate theory. See, they can't say what would cause the trench to decide to want to suck something down. Laws of physics are not there to try and suck it down. But next week we'll explain why. Now, here's their picture again, same picture from Wikipedia, and notice that all the volcanoes are because this crustal plate, as it grinds down along this crustal plate here, this subducting plate is grinding along this plate. Guess what that causes? Friction, heat, magma, melting, and that creates all these volcanoes in their pretty little picture. Do you see any volcanoes in the trenches here? Or do you see any in the seafloor here that before it's building up and it's just, remember, it's just built up at the mantle, it's pushing over this way. There's nothing that should create volcanoes right there on the seafloor as it's getting ready to go over to the trench and subduct. But look here, the actual ocean floor. There's 40,000 volcanoes on the ocean floor, and supposedly it's moving this way, subducting at the trenches here. And before it gets to the trenches, all of a sudden, 40,000 volcanoes litter the western Pacific floor. See all these bumps here in the ocean floor? 40,000 volcanoes. Not found anywhere else. There is no place on the ocean floor near any mid-oceanic ridges or anything else that have such a littering of volcanoes that are massive, even compared to the volcanoes that we have in our area. Mount Rainier, small compared to the stuff that's sitting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They can't explain why there's such a high concentration of volcanoes in the Pacific Ocean, but Dr. Walt Brown's Hydroplate Theory does explain why there's so many volcanoes on the Pacific Ocean. So their picture is an artist's conception of something that isn't even based on reality. And by the way, what do you think would happen if this seafloor is all of a sudden diving down at the trenches and has been doing so for millions of years? What would you expect the trench to be full of? Scraped off debris. Because you have the ridge that's building up seafloor that is moving, inches a year, millions of years, and then it dives down underneath the plate next to it that becomes the trench. So the trench is just a big scraping tool that would scrape off all the stuff that's on the seafloor, and you would expect the trench to be full of millions of years of scraped off debris off the floor. There's none. In fact, it's lightly layered in the trenches, never been disturbed, layers like you'd find in sedimentary layers. The theory doesn't support it. Another side view of the evolutionary model of how the Earth's crust and ocean floor is supposedly moving, a supposed heat source that's causing movement that cannot occur by the laws of physics, but it's in the minds of the people. And again, the layers that are found in the trenches are actually just laid down sedimentary layers that are not indicative of the debris that would have been all scooped off had that been occurring for millions of years. But there is this bend-off zone. There is a fault fracture through the mantle. And that's why they think it's a subducting plate. But that fracture zone is actually caused by something that we'll explain next week. They say that the plate dives down the overriding plate, but by the laws of physics, as soon as it would try and go down, there would be a great pressure trying to push it up. And so again, it is not consistent with physics to believe that plates can subduct. In fact, Dr. Brown lists 15 reasons why plate subduction cannot occur by the laws of physics. Some early models of plate tectonics, this is their words again, this is Wikipedia words. Tectonics envisioned the plates riding on top of convection cells like conveyor belts. Yeah, earlier on you told us that. However, most scientists working today believe that the asthenosphere is not strong enough to directly cause motion by the friction of such basal forces. So they told us that's how it happened. Now later on they're saying, but actually can't happen. Slab pull is most widely thought to be the greatest force. So now they're thinking, okay, slab pull, instead of it pushing through a conveyor effect, there's somebody down on the earth just sucking these slabs down, pulling them down. Slab pull is most widely thought to be the greatest force acting on the plates. Recent models indicate that trench suction plays an important role as well. However, it should be noted that the North American plate, for instance, is nowhere being subducted, yet it is in motion. Likewise, the African, Eurasian, and Arctic plates. The overall driving force for plate motion and its energy source remain subjects of ongoing research. You know what that means? We haven't got a clue. Our theory would predict that these things would not be moving if they weren't subducting, but they are moving, and we just haven't got a clue. And yet, the theory we'll cover next week explains it perfectly, why it's moving the way it is. So this is what the World Book Encyclopedia said in 1983, and nothing has really changed. Most scientists have accepted the basic idea that the continents moved in the past as part of large rigid plates. However, many details of the continental drift theory, which has been expounded on later that Wikipedia talks about, have not been widely accepted. One problem is the lack of proof that convection currents exist and that they provide the energy which moves the continents, and they still don't have an energy model that makes any physics sense. And a recent discovery about changes in rock density deep inside the Earth when rock melts makes current ideas about plate tectonics obsolete and untenable. And that is that they didn't know this till recently. Walt Brown realized it must be true years ago because they bounced earthquake waves. When earthquake waves occur, when an earthquake happens, earthquake waves pass through the Earth. They go all the way through the Earth. And so you put seismic stations all over the world, and you measure the intensity of the wave and how long it took to get to your station from any known place. And by a wave from one point on the Earth scattering through the whole Earth to all those seismic stations and measuring the time it took to get there, you can figure out the density of the inner Earth, because the density changes the velocity of the wave. And they know that the Earth is crust, underneath the crust is mantle, underneath the mantle is what's called the liquid outer core. And the liquid outer core, at that interface between the bottom of the mantle, rock, and the liquid outer core, the density doubles. And so now what scientists have discovered is that when you melt rock deep in the Earth, and this figure says that crossover depth right there, 400 miles deep into the mantle, when you melt a rock, it actually becomes more dense. Usually when you melt something, it becomes less dense, wants to float up. It becomes more dense. It halves its volume. And it means that once something melts at 400, did I say feet? I meant 400 miles down. At 400 miles down, once something melts, it can only go down. It can only go down to the liquid outer core. Nothing can cause magma to rise up to the Earth. It's too heavy. It becomes like lead in a way, and it wants to go down. So it destroys plate tectonics. And then here's another thing that destroys it. To the left again is their plate map showing the directions, and this is another Wikipedia picture, shows the directions of plate motion. And notice how they aren't doing a very good job showing the size of these arrows in which directions, and I think it's deliberate, because in the same Wikipedia article, they show you this map. This is a GPS map. This is a map based on the GPS of actual crustal movement. And the length of the arrow is how fast it's moving, and the arrow direction is which direction it's moving. And you can see from this map, everything is moving towards what? The Pacific. It is not moving, it's not moving in the direction of these arrows based on seafloor spreading from mid-oceanic ridges hooked up to crustal pieces. So in other words, the facts, these are facts. If you can trust GPS, which is down to centimeters, they can measure 1 centimeter's worth of movement anywhere on the Earth where these GPS stations are set up. So this is a fact. And this fact says that this is a figment of many people's imagination. The Earth is not moving in accordance with plate tectonics. It's moving because of something else. And it's all moving towards the Pacific. And so therefore, the fact actual movement of continents does not support plate tectonic theory, because here's where they say it's going to move. It's not consistent with observed facts. Location plays a very large role on the potential for earthquake disasters, with the most vulnerable sites lying along the boundaries of tectonic plates. So then they would say, why do earthquakes happen? They happen because of these movements. And where are they going to happen? They're going to happen at the plate boundaries. The majority of the world's earthquakes occur on the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is not the plate boundaries, but they make that point. And again, this is from science.org. The Indonesian archipelago is also highly susceptible to earthquakes, as are the Himalayan mountains, which have formed at the boundary between the Eurasian and the Indian plates. And then it goes on to say, not all earthquakes occur along the tectonic plate boundaries, however. See, if our theory were right, we would expect all the earthquakes to be at the boundaries. That's where they would be. That's where the motion is. That's where the stress is building up. However, that's not what we see. We actually see that the earthquake in Gujarat, India, in 2001 is located well away from the nearest plate boundary, and its cause is not well understood. The entire continent of Australia is in the middle of a tectonic plate, with no part of it near a major plate boundary. Australia should therefore be reasonably safe from big earthquakes, but they still occur from time to time. Since 1900, 17 earthquakes with magnitudes greater than 6 have been recorded. Our theory would say Australia should be the safest place to live, no need for earthquake insurance, no problem. However, it's not what we see. So why are there large earthquakes in Australia and in India, right in the middle of the India plate up here in India? The plate tectonics would say there should not be an earthquake there. There are. And all over the world, there's places in the middle of plates that are experiencing earthquakes. A final thought, if the Earth were billions of years old, there really should be no earthquakes. Because earthquakes are a result of something's not settled. Either thermally, the inside of the Earth should all have gotten to a cold temperature. There shouldn't be any temperature, source of heat by now to cause this convective current that they imagine in their minds. The Earth has been around for billions of years. Everything should be stable. You come back, you just stop building. You come back a billion years from now, this building's down, every building's down. Potential energy will ultimately, send everything down. Everything wants to get stable. We should be stable. There should be no earthquakes. Something cataclysmic happened to build up potential energy, to make high mountains, to make things unstable, to melt the inner Earth, to cause these problems. In fact, when they first started coming up with this seafloor spreading idea, they said, you know what, there must be a nuclear reactor down inside the Earth. It must be nuclear energy that's making this unstoppable heat, because all the heat would be gone if we'd been around for billions of years. And so they've set up sensors to try and catch a single neutrino coming from our reactor in the inner Earth. To show us that it is a nuclear reaction, but it's not. There's no nuclear reaction. Why is the inner Earth so hot? Why is there a liquid outer core? They don't know. Why is the center of the Earth solid? See, the center of the Earth is not liquid. It's solid. They used to think it was all liquid because that was where the hot reactor was, and everything was liquid in the center. There are earthquakes, so why? We'll find out next week. What does the Bible teach about them? What causes them? From an evolutionary plate tectonic perspective, we know that if we want to trust those guys, then we've got serious problems. They admit they don't know what they're talking about. They would like us to believe different and listen to them when we have our earthquakes, and they act like, oh, we just know. Billions of dollars are spent in the seismology field across the world, and there's a lot of money invested in the plate tectonic theory. Next week we'll cover why earthquakes occur from a hydroplate theory, and I hope it'll be a blessing to you, because it's to me it's just amazing that when the Earth does shake, to just realize why, and to realize it was all tied to a judgment that happened many thousands of years ago, and it's about to be unleashed in a way to make a future judgment for the world. In fact, when we had our big earthquake here, what was it, 2001? January 2001? When it started to shake, it was at the office. We had our church office at home, and in the home had double doors going outside, all plate glass, and I just stood there, went over to the doors. I wanted to see it. I just wanted to just experience it. And I went over to the doors and just watched outside, and the telephone poles were just going like this, and I would see the lines, the power lines were drooping way down, and then, because the poles were going back and forth, but at times they would droop way down because they'd go together like this, and then they would go apart and snap the lines tight. Didn't break them, but just sat there and snapped, and I'm just sitting there, praise God, look at this. And that power, the power of that earthquake was nothing. It was absolutely nothing. The God that we serve was able to breathe this entire planet into existence with just the breath of his mouth. He was able to save us from our sins when he became a man and died on the cross. to give us everlasting life forever and ever and ever. What a miracle that is. So, I again just wanted to welcome you to part 2 of a 2-part series on the origin of earthquakes. And last week we went over, and we're not going to really repeat, we went over all that the Bible has to teach about earthquakes. The Bible says, I'll summarize it this way. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes to the point where every mountain will be moved, every island will flee away, every city will be destroyed, every wall will be knocked down, and the earth will reel like a top. We went over all the verses covering that. I mentioned last week that evolutionary plate tectonic theory would say that's impossible. So if evolutionary plate tectonics theory of what's causing earthquakes over, stresses building up over millions of years, etc. If that's true, we'll never have a global earthquake. But the Bible says we are going to have a global earthquake. And last week we said that this week we will cover a theory of how the flood of Noah occurred, that the causes of the flood of Noah and how the flood of Noah occurred scientifically would put us in a position where global earthquakes could and will occur. And then we're going to conclude today with, what holds up to the facts of biblical prophecy and the facts of science. So we went over the Bible verses last week, and then we tried to do a real quick look at what does evolutionary plate tectonics teach. We did that last week. We're not going to do it again except by a review, and the reason why we can review it is if anybody goes to the supermarket that sells National Geographic, you're going to see this. This is the special edition. And if you look at this fine print, it says leave this on the shelf till July 2010. So we've got, here it is, May 2010, and we've got the July 2010 edition. That's pretty good, pretty up to date. And they talk about all of Mother Nature's fury, all the things happening, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, look at what's happening. And it's flying off the shelf. And fortunately, this provides just a little review for those that weren't here last week. The next slide, this is out of the National Geographic special edition. It shows the evolutionary mindset of what's going on in the inner earth, and you'll see those little arrows in the mantle. And see those little arrows right there? That's talking about these convective currents that are causing the crustal movements to occur, that over millions of years of very slow motion of these convective heat currents are causing plates that are on the earth to grind up against each other, and every once in a while the grinding snaps because of the stress buildup, snaps and gives us an earthquake. They say in here the earth, some 4.6 billion years ago, a dust cloud condensed to create our planet. That's what they say caused our planet. And by the way, there's no scientific support for that. Dust in space could not possibly, by the laws of physics, decide to condense to create an Earth. But that is their best guess of how the Earth got here, even though it's scientifically untenable. It is not possible. But that's what they say. Layers formed as it began to cool. Continual internal rolling moves heat to the surface for release. So this is their fairy tale. This is a fairy tale. They blame us for...
But at least we know it was exactly 4.6 billion.
Exactly 4.6. And I pity the poor sucker that says it's 4.7 billion years old, because they're wrong. By the way, if the Earth were 4.6 billion years old, it would be stable. There would be no earthquakes. And they'll say, and I'm going to go to some other quotes out of the National Geographic, they say there's some kind of nuclear energy down there. They never define how nuclear energy starts. In fact, nobody knows where the source of Earth's radioactivity. Everything that they say about the origin of Earth's radioactivity makes no sense scientifically. So there shouldn't be earthquakes by that map. Would you say there's earthquakes? Yeah, in 1 week, 1,354 on that map in the week. So another statement they make about the mantle: heat makes the rock in the mantle flow. Most comes from decaying radioactive isotopes in the layer itself. Where did they come from? They don't have an answer where the radioactive isotopes. They thought there was a reactor inside the Earth once, but they now know scientifically there isn't. And they don't even know that there is radioactive material in the mantle, but they assume it is, because where does the heat come from? So they assume a lot of things. Contact with the core provides the rest of the heat. And then they talk about tectonics. Rigid slabs of rock called tectonic plates make up the Earth's surface. The underlying rock is viscous, circulating in vast convection currents that slowly grind the slabs against each other. And I want to say right now that these convective currents go deep into the mantle. See, this is the inner core. This is a liquid outer core right in here. And this is the mantle. And see, they're talking the mantle going all the way down to the liquid outer core. And what I'm going to make a big emphasis on today, because it is the key to our understanding the real source of earthquakes, is that 400 miles deep into the Earth, in the shallow mantle, not deep in the mantle here, but shallow in the mantle, 400 miles deep, any rock that melts can only go down because its density increases, and it will never flow up. It can't, by the laws of physics and the new understanding of what happens to rock when it melts, when it's under the pressure of 400 miles deep, it is impossible, by the laws of physics, for that map to happen, for that explanation. It is false. It is a lie. Okay, so, and then earthquakes. When two slabs of crust crunch past each other, or one dives beneath the other, the ground shakes, sometimes violently. And that's a fact. That is, when plates are grinding. It's just what causes the grinding is what's going to change in our understanding tonight, I hope. All these statements by National Geographic are not supported by the facts, except, the earthquakes, the way they say the slabs are moving is not true. But there is movement. And we're going to explain what's really causing the movement. Not supported by the facts, but come from the wishful thinking of those telling the unscientific evolutionary fairy tale. And we, with boldness, can talk to our friends and neighbors about this when you're armed with this knowledge, which comes from Dr. Walt Brown's book, which we're going to explain here in a minute. So, part 2 tonight. That was the quick review. Hopefully that caught everybody up to speed that wasn't missed all last week. Part 2, today, May 12th, 2010. What causes earthquakes? And I'm going to be presenting that answer from the hydroplate theory perspective of the flood of Noah. And then we're going to look at which theory fits the evidence and what's consistent with biblical prophecy. And the teaching is based on a literal view of the Genesis account. I believe the literal, how the earth was created. It's based on the flood of Noah being a global cataclysmic event. There are some people profess to be Christians who think that the flood of Noah being global is a fantasy and that the Bible is wrong or it's being improperly interpreted. And if you've ever carefully read the account of the flood, God said the whole world got flooded in about 5 different ways. It's like everything that on the earth that had breath in its nostrils died, except for what was on Noah's Ark. I mean, he made it emphatically clear. It was a global cataclysmic flood. So, I again just wanted to welcome you to part 2 of a 2-part series on the origin of earthquakes. And last week we went over, and we're not going to really repeat, we went over all that the Bible has to teach about earthquakes. The Bible says, I'll summarize it this way. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes to the point where every mountain will be moved, every island will flee away, every city will be destroyed, every wall will be knocked down, and the earth will reel like a top. We went over all the verses covering that. I mentioned last week that evolutionary plate tectonic theory would say that's impossible. So if evolutionary plate tectonics theory of what's causing earthquakes over, stresses building up over millions of years, etc., if that's true, we'll never have a global earthquake. But the Bible says we are going to have a global earthquake. And last week we said that this week we will cover a theory of how the flood of Noah occurred, that the causes of the flood of Noah and how the flood of Noah occurred scientifically would put us in a position where global earthquakes could and will occur. And then we're going to conclude today with, what holds up to the facts of biblical prophecy and the facts of science. So we went over the Bible verses last week, and then we tried to do a real quick look at what does evolutionary plate tectonics teach. We did that last week. We're not going to do it again except by a review, and the reason why we can review it is if anybody goes to the supermarket that sells National Geographic, you're going to see this. This is the special edition. And if you look at this fine print, it says leave this on the shelf till July 2010. So we've got, here it is, May 2010, and we've got the July 2010 edition. That's pretty good, pretty up to date. And they talk about all of Mother Nature's fury, all the things happening, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, look at what's happening. And it's flying off the shelf. And fortunately, this provides just a little review for those that weren't here last week. The next slide, this is out of the National Geographic special edition. It shows the evolutionary mindset of what's going on in the inner earth, and you'll see those little arrows in the mantle. And see those little arrows right there? That's talking about these convective currents that are causing the crustal movements to occur, that over millions of years of very slow motion of these convective heat currents are causing plates that are on the earth to grind up against each other, and every once in a while the grinding snaps because of the stress buildup, snaps and gives us an earthquake. They say in here the Earth, some 4.6 billion years ago, a dust cloud condensed to create our planet. That's what they say caused our planet. And by the way, there's no scientific support for that. Dust in space could not possibly, by the laws of physics, decide to condense to create an Earth. But that is their best guess of how the Earth got here, even though it's scientifically untenable. It is not possible. But that's what they say. Layers formed as it began to cool. Continual internal rolling moves heat to the surface for release. So this is their fairy tale. This is a fairy tale. They blame us for...
But at least we know it was exactly 4.6 billion.
Exactly 4.6. And I pity the poor sucker that says it's 4.7 billion years old, because they're wrong. By the way, if the Earth were 4.6 billion years old, it would be stable. There would be no earthquakes. And they'll say, and I'm going to go to some other quotes out of the National Geographic, they say there's some kind of nuclear energy down there. They never define how nuclear energy starts. In fact, nobody knows where the source of Earth's radioactivity. Everything that they say about the origin of Earth's radioactivity makes no sense scientifically. So there shouldn't be earthquakes by that map. Would you say there's earthquakes? Yeah, in 1 week, 1,354 on that map in the week. So another statement they make about the mantle: heat makes the rock in the mantle flow. Most comes from decaying radioactive isotopes in the layer itself. Where did they come from? They don't have an answer where the radioactive isotopes. They thought there was a reactor inside the Earth once, but they now know scientifically there isn't. And they don't even know that there is radioactive material in the mantle, but they assume it is because where does the heat come from? So they assume a lot of things. Contact with the core provides the rest of the heat. And then they talk about tectonics. Rigid slabs of rock called tectonic plates make up the Earth's surface. The underlying rock is viscous, circulating in vast convection currents that slowly grind the slabs against each other. And I want to say right now that these convective currents go deep into the mantle. See, this is the inner core. This is a liquid outer core right in here. And this is the mantle. And see, they're talking the mantle going all the way down to the liquid outer core. And what I'm going to make a big emphasis on today, because it is the key to our understanding the real source of earthquakes, is that 400 miles deep into the earth, in the shallow mantle, not deep in the mantle here, but shallow in the mantle, 400 miles deep, any rock that melts can only go down because its density increases, and it will never flow up. It can't, by the laws of physics and the new understanding of what happens to rock when it melts, when it's under the pressure of 400 miles deep, it is impossible by the laws of physics for that map to happen, for that explanation. It is false. It is a lie. Okay, so, and then earthquakes. When two slabs of crust crunch past each other, or one dies beneath the other, the ground shakes, sometimes violently. And that's a fact. That is, when plates are grinding. It's just what causes the grinding is what's going to change in our understanding tonight, I hope. All these statements by National Geographic are not supported by the facts, except, the earthquakes, the way they say the slabs are moving is not true. But there is movement. And we're going to explain what's really causing the movement. Not supported by the facts, but come from the wishful thinking of those telling the unscientific evolutionary fairy tale. And we, with boldness, can talk to our friends and neighbors about this when you're armed with this knowledge, which comes from Dr. Walt Brown's book, which we're going to explain here in a minute. So, part 2 tonight. That was the quick review. Hopefully that caught everybody up to speed that wasn't missed all last week. Part 2, today, May 12th, 2010. What causes earthquakes? And I'm going to be presenting that answer from the hydroplate theory perspective of the flood of Noah. And then we're going to look at which theory fits the evidence and what's consistent with biblical prophecy. And the teaching is based on a literal view of the Genesis account. I believe the literal, how the earth was created. It's based on the flood of Noah being a global cataclysmic event. There are some people profess to be Christians who think that the flood of Noah being global is a fantasy and that the Bible is wrong or it's being improperly interpreted. And if you've ever carefully read the account of the flood, God said the whole world got flooded in about 5 different ways. It's like everything that on the earth that had breath in its nostrils died, except for what was on Noah's Ark. I mean, he made it emphatically clear. It was a global cataclysmic flood. Cataclysmic flood. And it's also based on Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which his website is at creationscience.com, and you can read all about how the flood of Noah occurred and the scientific support for it. This slide shows the 8th edition of his book, and Dr. Walt Brown, again, creationscience.com. So, because it's really important to get an overview of his theory to really, narrow in on what we're going to talk about today, in 1993 there was a CBS special that featured an animation of Dr. Brown's theory of the flood, while CBS did a special on In Search of Noah's Ark. And so we're going to watch what was shown to millions of Americans in 1993 as just a quick summary of the entire hydroplate theory that will be the basis for then tunneling in, looking narrowly at the melting of the inner earth and when that happened, how it results in earthquakes on the earth today.
We turn to the retired director of one of the Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown.
We can see on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained. as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the Hydroplate Theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell, about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
So, I hope there were things since 1993. Dr. Brown has made other scientific observations and discoveries that have added to that. He was talking about the weight of the crust pushing down on the water, jettisoned it up 20 miles. We now know that the water actually reached supercritical temperature and came out explosively because of it being at supercritical temperature, and we don't have time to get into that. it not only went 20 miles up, it launched the comets into space. And there was tremendous energy. The reason why it heated up, all that other stuff we don't have time to get into, but it was explosive. If you would have been out in space, this is what it would have looked like on Earth when the fountains of the great deep burst open in one day. And this is what it says: in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So the water jettisoned out of this crack, and it would have, the water at the edge of the crack would have gone up with some velocity, but come down as just regular rain. Closer to the center of the crack, it would have gone up into space, but you know, whatever goes up is going to come down, unless it's fast enough to leave Earth's gravitational attraction, which is several miles per second. But the stuff that went up into space came down, buried the mammoths while they're chewing on tropical vegetation still in their mouth, and they died standing up, crushed by all the ice that was coming down. And some was with enough to escape Earth's gravity, and they became comets, and some of the other debris became asteroids, but we're not here for that. But there was tremendous energy. Things have changed since the video that you just saw, but this is a fountain that would have been eroding the crack on each side. You know, the crack creates a side of the crust to the left, a side of the crust to the right. That water jettisoning from the subterranean chambers would have hydroblasted the edge of that crack, spreading debris all over the earth and up into space. So as the crack would have widened, and you know, looking at this picture here, at first, when it first jettisoned, it's just a small crack. It would have cut away at the crust, making the crack wider and wider. Everybody kind of follow that concept? And ultimately, the crack would have been big enough that the mantle underneath the crust would have seen this as a low pressure area to spring up into. 10 miles below the Earth's surface, you're 60-some thousand pounds per square inch. Some people think as rock can't just bow up. But rock under that pressure is like a spring. Everything under pressure is like a spring. You know, you put steel under enough pressure and it's going to actually shrink molecularly. You're pushing the molecules closer together. You remove the stress, it's going to get bigger. So everything acts as a spring, and down that deep, the mantle would have acted like a spring and popped up. And this is known physics, actually. And would have looked like that. That's what the mid-oceanic ridge looks like on the ocean floor for the 40-some thousand miles of its entire length. Is the mantle popping up, and you would have seen the tension cracks along the ridge. Those are tension cracks as it comes up and opens up this way, and then you have perpendicular to the tension cracks of the axis of the ridge, you see one's perpendicular. And that's exactly what would have happened as it pulled itself up as it went along, coming up from being the floor of the subterranean. So this is, for those that don't know what's on the ocean floor, that is one 40-some thousand mile long mid-oceanic ridge that's continually tied together when you have it on a globe. It goes over here. And very hard to explain other than what Dr. Brown believes is the source of that ridge. It's a result of Noah's flood. But this is what's so important, and that is that the ridge, when it lifts up, it can't create a void space like is shown in Dr. Brown's simulation. This is a mattress, a foam mattress that he crushes, but he presses in between these two ends of this little demonstration, and then he lays heavy chunks of wood on top of the mattress, and when he has these pieces on, the mattress stays down. But the mattress is like a spring, like the mantle. So he pulls off the center one, and it doesn't spring up. He pulls off two more, doesn't spring up. Pull off two more, and it pops up, just like the ridge does. Does everybody follow that? But when it pops up, his demonstration makes a void underneath. When the ridge of the Atlantic popped up, it can't leave a void. There's tremendous pressure deep inside the earth. So what has to happen? As it's moving up, something has to come and take that place. So the inner earth is starting to move towards that rising mid-Atlantic ridge. They call the entire 40-some thousand mile ridge the mid-oceanic ridge. But the one in the Atlantic is the one that grew first and grew the most. And it was from that that everything moved away from. But it was growing all over the earth. So for this ridge to be lifted up here in the Atlantic, something had to move into its place. And what moved into its place is the inner earth. When you move rock, mantle material in the inner earth under tens of thousands of pounds per square inch, hundreds of thousands of pounds per square inch when you get deep enough, what's going to happen? You're going to create massive frictional heat. You're going to melt the rock. As the rock's moving, it's going to instantly just melt. And this is really key, because when rock melts below 400 miles in the earth, it shrinks in its volume. It increases in its density. And this is going to be very important. And I know we're talking scientific terms, and if you never signed up for physics or chemistry, you're going to say, what's density, what's volume? And I'm sorry, we lost you, and I'm going to try and get you back. But the inner earth is getting smaller. Just understand that. The inner earth is melting below 400 miles and gets smaller, which creates further instabilities in our earth. So what happened is that you have collapsing on the other side of the earth, on the western Pacific, you have a Pacific plate. There used to be a continent where the western Pacific is right now. But its foundation was undermined by the melting of the inner earth, and it sank down many miles down. And when it sank down, that caused the Atlantic to rise even further and allowed the Americas to move to the west, Europe, Asia, and Africa to move to the east away from the rising floor, and everything's coming crashing at the Pacific. I know this is complicated, but rising Atlantic, so America and South America want to move away from the Atlantic to the west. Asia, Africa want to move away from the mid-Atlantic ridge rising, they want to move to the east. And where do they come crashing? Pacific. Everything comes crashing around to the Pacific side. Again, this is looking at the Earth with a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle, a crust, and that little dashed line is how, this is to scale. This is showing the scale of how deep into the mantle is that crossover depth. And I'm going to emphasize this with an analogy. For those that have ever gone diving, I know there's a diver here, even if you haven't, you'd be able to handle this concept. You take a plastic milk bottle and you empty it, no more milk, it's all air, and you put the lid on it and you tie a rock to it. And you dive down and you go into the water deeper and deeper, higher and higher pressure. That higher and higher pressure of the water will start to compress the air inside of the milk bottle. And the milk bottle's volume will get less, and the density of the air inside will get higher. Does everybody follow that so far? This is really important. There is a depth that if the diver lets go of the milk bottle, that milk bottle with the weight that's hanging to it will be exactly neutral buoyancy, and it'll just stay right there. Does everybody follow that? If the diver goes a little bit shallower, goes back up, and he lets go of the milk bottle, what happens? It's going to rise to the surface, and it's going to actually rise faster and faster as it gets closer and closer to the surface. If he's at that exact neutral buoyancy and he decides to go down from there, what's going to happen when he lets go of the bottle? It's going to go down, and the deeper it goes, it's going to go faster and faster and faster. The exact same thing happens inside our Earth when rock melts. At 400 miles deep, when rock melts, 400 miles, I keep doing that. At 400 miles, when a rock frictional heat from some deep earthquake, and there are earthquakes that are that deep. One happened in Spain a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago or so. When rock melts at 400 miles deep, the volume and density of the rock turning to liquid when it melted changes nothing. Volume is the same, density is the same. As soon as you go a little bit lower and you melt rock, the rock actually now takes less room, less volume, more density, and now something else has to fill the place because it's now shrunk. So everybody follow that. Okay, very, very important. So when rock melts above the crossover depth, its magma is trying to find some volcano or some other way to get up shallower. When rock melts below that, it's trying to get to the liquid outer core. Any further cracking or fissures that open, that want to any slipping, that liquid magma now is denser than the rock around it, and it's trying to get deeper and deeper and deeper. Its density is greater than the rock around it. It cannot go up. What evolutionists teach about this circulating currents is like believing that an axe head can surface all of a sudden on the water that's sunk because somebody throws an axe head into the water, which we know is a miracle, and God can do that. But the evolutionists, they believe in a miracle. They believe a miracle has caused the mantle to circulate because by the laws of physics and science, their little fairy tale needs a miracle. It's not scientific. So, and they accuse us of, being brain dead. But okay, this is the graph. And this is a graph out of a scientific paper of the Japanese that discovered this crossover depth pressure. And just by way of understanding it, this is the density when rock melts. This is the magma line. Magma means melted rock. So this line is the deeper you go. And when you go up, it's the shallower you go. And when you move to the right, you're increasing in density. When you move to the left, you're decreasing in density. So you can see that when rock melts here, it's less than the density of solid rock there. So it wants to float up. Does everybody follow that? But you can see that as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, liquid rock starts to approach the same density as solid rock. Does everybody see that? And then those two lines cross right here, and that's the crossover depth. Does everybody see that? And then when you get to the interface, and this is going to be important in a graph I'm going to show in a minute, but the liquid outer core, which anything that melts down here, rock which melts below this depth will become more dense and move towards the outer liquid. It's going to go down, and right here, this is solid rock, mantle, and right there is liquid outer core. Do you see the density difference? 5.5 and 10. So in other words, a rock right at that depth, at the depth of where it goes from being solid rock to melting to become liquid outer core, its volume shrinks by half. That's huge. That's a huge difference. And that shrinking in half has now undermined the foundation of everything above it. It's creating a stress in all the mantle and crust above it because you've just taken away some of the foundation of everything that is above the place where that rock melted. Any melting of rock below this depth results in the undermining of the mantle and crust foundation. This is the reason why there will be massive and global earthquakes in the future. And let me play this out. There are deep earthquakes. Every single deep earthquake is melting rock, which is causing greater stresses on all the remaining crust and mantle. So the stresses are increasing all over the world. You can have a deep earthquake in Spain, and it's putting stress in America underneath our foundation because it's a sphere that's losing the foundations on the inside. And so then, now there's more stress. The strength of the rock, if the strength of the rock can take the stress that solid rock was holding before it became liquid, liquid can't take stress. Okay, so solid rock is holding stress. As soon as it melts, it's no longer holding any stress. It has to give the stress it was holding to the surrounding rock. If the surrounding rock was almost ready to break before the earthquake happened, then it takes that extra little stress and it says, that's more than I can handle too. It melts. It faults and it melts. So now it's not holding anything, and it has to take the stress it had and pass it on to the rock next to it, but it's saying, now you just overloaded me. Does everybody see the problem with that? It's technically what happened to the trade towers, and I'm going to assume that, you know, we didn't purposely drop them through thermal burning. But when you heat up the steel of a building, if that's what happened, if you heat up the steel of the building, ultimately hot steel can't hold as much as room temperature steel. And so then it can't hold, so a beam finally gets so hot it can't take the stress, puts it to the other beams, they're already hot too, the whole thing comes down. So for those that, you know, are into the conspiracy theory of the trade towers, then, you know, you're saying, oh, Kevin, you don't know the facts. I've heard them, I just don't know what really happened, but I know that if you heat up a structure and it can't hold it, it's going to fall. And getting back to the Earth, the scientific fact associated with increasing density of melted rock magma below the crossover depth makes the National Geographic article a glossy tabloid fantasy. It sure looks nice, though. It is glossy. They did a great job with the picture. It's just not possible. The inner Earth resulted in the collapse of the supporting rock under the Pacific Plate and the formation of the trenches. The scientific evidence that's on the Pacific floor says that this happened. A massive melting occurred and a massive block faulting of the mantle and crustal material happened. And Dr. Brown has calculated by just looking at how big the liquid outer core is. And if you assumed all that liquid outer core at one time was solid mantle that now has melted and shrunk. Let's say that 10% of that melting and the associated volume decrease, density increase, 10% of it happened before the continent started moving like we saw in the video. Then the entire Pacific would have dropped 18 miles to take that much volume. He's not saying 10% did melt. He just said, let's assume 10% of that volume difference happened before the continent started moving, and then apply that volume to the entire Pacific basin, it would have dropped 18 miles. That's just to get a feel for how big of a change in volume this melting of the inner Earth is. And now we're going to show another animation that George Hess did many years ago. And this is just showing the rising ridge in the Atlantic causing the granite plates to move. And now think about this, the rising ridge in the Atlantic is melting the inner Earth, allowing the Pacific to actually collapse and fall, making a downward, an upper, lifting the plate up on one side, lowering the plate on the other side, and off we go. It's truly like having a train on a track, and you just lift one side, drop the other side, train's going to go on the track, lubricated by the water underneath. And this is just an animation showing plates moving, and obviously when any frictional obstruction comes, you're going to be melting, and he doesn't show the melting and everything, but that kind of a collision happened on the Pacific side, and there would have been massive melting underneath the crust. The damage that would have been done, in the crust and the mantle area would have made massive amounts of magma, which is underneath. The next slide shows that, I'm going to tell you before you see this, for those that remember the Denali Earthquake in November 2002, remember that? In Alaska. Not the one that we had in 2001, but the Denali earthquake in Alaska. How many people knew that big earthquake in Alaska shook houseboats off of their sewer lines and mooring lines in Lake Union? Okay? And you're going to see the news, you're going to see the nightly news that night that I watched, and then we worked out with the Como TV to get a clip of this for educational purposes, so we got the rights to do this, to show you what happened in the nightly broadcast of the earthquake in Alaska, which is not very close to Lake Union.
and it was just going kabam, kabam, kabam.
That's one of the eyewitness accounts on Lake Union, where houseboats suddenly rocked so violently that water and sewage lines snapped in two.
So the whole thing shifted, actually at quite a bit of distance.
Floating homes were rocking differently than any of these homeowners ever witnessed before.
Not this up and down
Right,
you would get
usually
if
you
a
go
boat
like
came
this.
through here. And so we just didn't, it was very disorienting. And then we realized that it was the water going this way.
And seismologists say they could blame the Alaska quake. While it didn't generate a tsunami, energy waves traveling through water could indeed slosh Lake Union.
You do get this very low frequency motion, very slow up and down, and that can cause bodies of water to sort of slosh, a little bit like in a bathtub.
Seismologists say there are similar reports from Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans and from nuclear power plants as far away as Minnesota, where tonight they're asking the same questions heard on Lake Union.
And then looked out to say, what is happening here?
Okay, now, the seismologists are pretty amazing. The earthquake waves could go through water. Well, it only happened in Lake Union. There's hundreds of lakes between here and Denali, Alaska that nobody was reporting. Nobody talked about the hundreds of lakes and bodies of water between Denali, Alaska and thousands of miles away in Lake Pontchartrain. I talked to somebody who was an eyewitness at Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. He said Lake Pontchartrain all of a sudden looked like a bathtub that somebody had taken and just shook. Snapped 1-inch mooring lines on boats. And so if it's just the earthquake waves flowing through the land that hits Lake Union, then it would have been everything between Alaska and Lake Union. And for those that are familiar with physics, the energy associated with an earthquake in Alaska diminishes by the cube of the distance. So in other words, how did we have the energy to knock houseboats off hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Alaska? There should have been houseboats, everything else going all over the place. But as far as Missouri, Yellowstone's geysers were affected, Lake Pontchartrain was shaken, and so what's the explanation? The explanation is hydraulics. Underneath the continents, the continental crust, is melted magma and water left over from the way God created the earth. The water is left over from how God created the earth with some water underneath. Not all of it jettisoned out. And by the magma of the compression event of the crust coming to a screeching halt underneath. So what happened in Alaska with that big earthquake is that's like pushing down the brake on your car. And then the hydraulics are going underneath the continent looking for weak places. One of the weak places is Lake Union. For those of you that have houseboats and other buildings in Lake Union, I would say based on this, you should leave, because the next really big earthquake could just pop the brake cylinders and blow the land right out, and it could just be a horrible disaster on Lake Union. Because it pressed, the hydraulics were pushing on Lake Union, and Lake Union was weak enough to actually move and shake houseboats. And Lake Pontchartrain was weak enough to shake houseboats. Does everybody follow the thought, I hope? So, this just gets a feel of the distance. See, this is the earthquake from Alaska all the way to New Orleans, thousands of miles away. Eyewitness account to me told me he couldn't believe it. Nobody could believe it. All of a sudden, it's like, at the time they didn't know the Alaska earthquake. They were just, wow, what happened to the lake? Somebody just shook it up. So, the crossover depth is about 400 miles deep. It's really important. The center of the trenches, which are the deepest places in the Pacific Ocean, are exactly opposite of the rising Atlantic ridge. In other words, when the Atlantic rose, it pulled away the foundation on the Pacific side, and parts of the crust crushed down into the trenches on the Pacific side. There's no trenches over on the Atlantic side. All the trenches are in the Pacific. The center of them are exactly opposite the Atlantic ridge. Plus, as the foundation was removed from underneath the Pacific and block faulting would have occurred on the crust, magma would have been created. That magma would have been pouring out onto the surface. There are 40,000 volcanoes on the Pacific Ocean floor. There's not thousands of volcanoes on the Atlantic floor or any. This is the concentration, the highest concentration, far exceeding anything else found on any part of the ocean floor. And the concentration of volcanoes in the Pacific floor on the ocean side of the trenches is completely contrary to evolutionary plate tectonic theory. And this is the graph that I wanted to show you. This is a scientific fact. Over here you'll see the depth column, and this is 2,800 miles down into the Earth. The interface between, this is the very bottom of the solid mantle, this is the very top of the liquid outer core. 3,000 miles deep is the very top of the liquid outer core, and you see the density is 5.5 in the rock, and just below the rock in the liquid outer core it goes to 10.1. That's a fact based on earthquake sound waves. They know the density very accurately. They know that at that interface there's that big of a density difference. That's a huge deal. So, based on the theory, the inner Earth before the flood didn't have a liquid outer core, it just had an inner Earth, mantle material with a crust that was around it. And you'll notice I deliberately made this Earth bigger than this Earth, because the Earth was bigger in radius, circumference. And after the flood, the inner solid core and the source of Earth's magnetic field was formed. The liquid outer core, which is a result of the melting of the inner Earth, was formed. And see, these are fault lines that have occurred in the mantle and in the crust as a result of something has to fault as the Earth is getting smaller. So everybody see, if you have a ball this big and you're going to make it this big, something has to fault and to keep on collapsing down on top of its ever shrinking size. Which, by the way, what does that make the Earth do? Spin faster or slower? It spins faster. So that will cause the Earth to have more days in a year or less days in a year? More days in a year. Why were all the calendars of antiquity based on how many days a year? 360 days. And see, that's because before the flood, okay, they had it all figured out. 360 days, all the calendars. When the flood's over and Noah comes out of his boat, God hasn't told him, the melting of the inner Earth has just sped the Earth up because the volume has decreased, and therefore you need to readjust your thinking. They stuck with 360 until they realized everything's out of whack with 360. A few years go by. Wait a second, I'm having to plant my crops different every year because it's not 360 days. And so they went through, if you look in antiquity, there is so much evidence in antiquity that people struggled with the change of the calendar, which was a result of the change of the inner Earth shrinking us. Every single major earthquake causes the Earth to spin faster. It's a fact today. And you would expect it because every major earthquake is causing melting, the Earth is continuing to get smaller, and it's spinning faster. The effects of a decreasing inner Earth volume can be demonstrated by removing the foundation of air pressure from the inside of a toilet bowl float. And for that demonstration, I bought one of these today. This is your Earth before the flood, and it's probably apropos. It's pretty corrupt Earth. This is the toilet bowl float. So if it's not totally spherical like an Earth, but it's close enough for our little demonstration. So if I remove the foundation of air inside, what we did is we put some steam inside this ball, and there's no air in there. So as this thing cools down, it's losing air pressure inside the ball. It's losing its foundation that was holding the ball round, because you think the inside of that was hollow, but it wasn't. This is your Earth on Judgment. Okay? Now, if we could put a microphone, oh, it's making some noises. You know what those are? Earthquakes. If we had it totally solid, it would be faulting. And if you had it solid like a sphere, it would be faulting in 45-degree angles, angled down in the different layers that were there, and it would actually make it look like a plate was subducting. It'd make it look like it's going underneath against a fault boundary, like it's diving down into the earth. It's not diving down into the earth, it's just having to get a smaller and smaller internal volume. Did this properly visually make it clear? It's not going to shrink that much, the earth. If it did, we would all be flooded because the water is going to be sitting on top. And that's another thing. As the earth experiences in the future further additional massive melting on the inside, the earth's going to get smaller, the same amount of water is on the outside. What's going to happen? It's going to flood more. The Bible says the islands are going to go away. Every mountain is going to be moved. There's going to be major upheavals in the crustal effects of the earth. You know, the crustal elevations are going to change. And so this is a scientific fact that there are these what they call Benioff zones. They know that there's a fault next to, through the mantle deep. They say it's a subducting plate. Dr. Brown would say it's a fault associated with the mantle and crust having to compress down on an ever smaller inner earth. This gives the appearance of subducting plates, but they are not subducting as evolutionists describe. So the Atlantic Ridge raised first as the continents moved towards the Pacific, which was subsiding due to the melting of the inner earth, and it decided to subside there first. And this is a map generated by the United States Geological Surveys associated with, and it's actually JPL NASA. So this is not a Christian map. These are the GPS people, global positioning satellite sensors all over the earth measuring the movement of continents. And you'll notice that everything is moving towards the Pacific. All these arrows, the length of the arrows is how far it's moving in relation to other GPS sensors and the direction of travel. These are in centimeters, so things are still crashing towards the Pacific. And this fact is not consistent with conventional plate tectonic theories. This actual observed movement of the plates of the earth is not consistent with what the evolutionist plate tectonic model shows, but it is perfectly consistent with Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory. This is a secular news article. Chile earthquake may have shortened days on the earth. And it did shorten days on the earth. They were thinking it was. It did shorten it. And it also said that it moved the Earth's axis by 3 inches because of a movement of the Earth's crust. If you rearrange the mass on a spinning sphere, that sphere will roll. And so the Earth rolled 3 inches. That's because South America moved 10 feet. I think last week I said 15 feet. I forgot. It's 10 feet to the west. These are GPS coordinates. These arrows are how far and in what direction South America moved during the recent Chile earthquake. 10 feet. And as a result of the true source of earthquakes, in the future, there's going to be more of this. Now, the first time I saw this picture, I thought this was a building that was built horizontal like this, and it just split in the middle. So that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-story building was standing vertical, and in the Chile earthquake, the ground movement and shaking by all of a sudden just moving 10 feet in one direction, took that entire building and just rolled it over and then broke its back on the parking lot. And that must have, this probably was a parking area. Dr. Brown's theory explains why 80% of all earthquake activity takes place around the Pacific Rim. This is where everything came to a crashing halt. And that's why there's still instabilities. It also explains why there will be increasing earthquake activity where it is not normally seen or expected. So right now, I've been watching this map a long time, and you see there's hardly ever any earthquake activity here. I mean, like, never. But see, as the inner earth melts and shrinks, there's going to be the stresses put on the top, and who knows what's going to let loose. There's going to be places that there's going to be faults developed that weren't there before, because that is now experiencing the greatest stress and lets loose and causes an earthquake. And what did a very reliable source say? Jesus. He said, "For nation will rise against nation in the future, in the last days, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places." And when they start popping all over the place, and one earthquake causes a whole slurry chain of events, earthquakes, and places that haven't been seeing earthquake activity for decades and centuries that people said never going to happen here because it doesn't go along with what we would consider to be a fault zone by plate tectonics, and they start seeing all that happen, they're going to realize we've got something wrong because they didn't know what the true source of earthquakes was. Conclusion: the evolutionary plate tectonic theory is inconsistent with biblical prophecy and science, and is taught in every classroom in America as fact. Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory explanation for the inner earth is consistent with biblical prophecy and consistent with science. Perfectly consistent with science and physics. And it says in Peter, 2 Peter 2:5, "And God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly." That's what happened 5,000 years ago. And then it says, and only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And they had to do that by faith. By faith, God said, "You know what? This place is wicked." Noah says, "Yeah, I know. And I'm going to destroy the place." "Okay, what do I do?" I want you to build a boat. I want you to get inside. I'm going to shut the door. If you believe me by faith, you'll live. You reject it, you'll die. And it says that he was a preacher of righteousness. That means he told everybody that wanted, that was around, he was preaching, God's judgment's coming. You need to get on the boat. And I'm sure, I wasn't there, I can assume human nature hasn't changed over the centuries, probably not over the millennia. He would have been laughed to scorn. The Bible also says the same place in Peter, "But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." When these future massive earthquakes occur and faults are opened up into magma pools that are created during the flood, there will be cataclysmic events happening on this earth, this time fire, rather than water and flood. And Jesus told us it would be so, and it's another thing that's consistent with the hydroplate theory. All that magma and stuff is ready for Judgment Day, coming on the earth. Are you on the ark? What's the ark today? The ark is Jesus. And the world wants to laugh us to scorn. Oh, we're going to solve our problems. We're going to drill for oil. Isn't it funny how people that solve problems? And I mean, I'm all for it too, but it just shows you. Did you know that one report is that the BP executives flew out to the oil well to celebrate their safety record of having just successfully completed the drilling of the well that was in the final stages of being made ready for production, and they're sipping suds and high-fiving, "Aren't we good?" Just like the Titanic. In fact, I wonder, as I grow older and I see the effects of man's pride, I kind of wonder, what would I have done if I had a all expense paid trip to New York on the maiden voyage of the Titanic, and I was walking on the pier and I happened to see the sign that one of the builders put on the pier saying, "God couldn't sink this ship." I hope I would have been spiritual enough to say, "Anybody want my ticket?" Because the pride of man is incredible. And see, either we have Jesus, and he is our Savior, and we are trusting on him, and we are standing on the rock, or you're trusting in man to solve man's problems, when everything that we look at is man, everything man touches turns to disaster. Everything man promises, God couldn't sink this ship, nobody's going to mess with our oil wells, nobody's going to this, nobody, everything just shows the frailty and the inability of man to do what they hope to do. I would rather put my hope and trust in the God who created the universe than to put my hope and trust in man. And so, if the answer to are you on the ark, Jesus, is yes, then you are saved. And though we might experience an earthquake in Kitsap County or Mason County tomorrow that could collapse all the buildings, and what do we have a hope of if all of a sudden the building comes down on us and knocks us on the head? We're going to go be with Jesus. We have a hope. So I don't want this to scare anybody and say, oh no, what are we going to do? Global earthquakes. I hope you're scared really bad if you don't know Jesus, if you're not on the ark. And I hope you do something about finding Jesus, because he is our rock spiritually, and nothing will move him. The earthquakes are coming, and they're going to be bad, but nothing is going to touch our soul being saved by Jesus, and we have an inheritance in heaven.
And sing of his glory. The time is now. And sing of his glory.